Welcome back to the Trackstar Podcast, a conversation about music and culture centered around a playlist I've specifically created for our guests. This week, we're talking about Paul McCartney and his career immediately after leaving the Beatles.
McCartney and Wings are top 5 acts of the 70s, but when you talk about the 70s, nobody ever mentions them.
How do you pick yourself up and put yourself back together when you've been the biggest, most important rock star in the world?
I mean, that's Paul's whole thing, not doubting your own creative instincts.
Our guest this week is Academy and Grammy Award-winning filmmaker Morgan Neville, who's made countless documentaries about a wide variety of musicians. His latest work, Man on the Run, is about Paul McCartney, and he has countless stories about spending time one-on-one with Paul making this movie.
Just became these sessions where we get together and we talk. I asked him about being a workaholic, and he said, well, you don't work music, you play music. He does it because it's his lifeblood, you know, it's like what he loves.
Do you think he's like self-conscious of the audience that's coming to the shows? Or
he has to figure out, who am I if I'm not a Beatle?
Paul's music career outside of the Beatles is often understandably overshadowed by his time within the band, but I think, as you'll see in this episode, his musical and creative output in this period is truly incredible.
The first interview I did with Paul, the entire couch was like this big, and Paul's sitting here like this. He's like, okay. I was like, tell me about John. You know?
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Check.
You ready?
I'm ready.
Trackstar, let's go.
I wish the world could be in these headphones right now.
I'm on the show. Have fun.
We're off to a very hot start here. Before we start with the music, just introduce yourself.
I'm Morgan Neville, director of Man on the Run.
Man on the Run. I just watched it the other night. Really great movie. It's about Paul McCartney and the period after the Beatles. About a 10-year period.
The decade, basically, after the Beatles break up. And the film really kind of begins essentially the day the Beatles break up, September 16th, 1969. If you want to put a date on it, you know, people can debate it, but that's the day the Beatles had a band meeting and John said, I want a divorce. And Paul doesn't know what to do. And Linda, his new wife, with their new baby, run off to a shack in rural Scotland and make a new life.
There's so much to cover here, but I want to center this conversation around songs from that period, songs that stand out to me as being particularly meaningful and interesting, and those can guide us through. So we'll start early, and then we'll go through the years.
So how much do you know about Paul? Like, I'm curious what your level of knowledge or interest is coming in.
I read a book over the summer. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a biography about Paul. Yeah. That was like this thick. I should have remembered the name of the conversation. And I was fascinated. And he was really opening up and telling his story from when they were kids all the way through like the 90s.
Yeah.
And I know that Paul is the one in the group who has the strongest sense of musicality. Mm-hmm. And he's the one that brings a lot of the melody and the charm into stuff, whereas John is the one that's sort of pushing the envelope a little bit more in the partnership. That's how I think about the two of them in contrast to one another.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, you can talk about John and Paul forever, but I think that's true. But then there are always exceptions. Yeah. You know, there's like the beautiful, delicate melody of a John song like Julia. And then there's like, Why Don't We Do It in the Road? Or, you know, Let Me Roll It, or some, you know, heavy Helter Skelter, you know, Paul song, you know, which you just don't think about.
Yeah. There's a great book called A Love Story. John and Paul.
Yeah. Yeah. By Ian Leslie. Yeah.
And it speaks to that partnership, but then, like you said, how sometimes they flip roles. So I don't know. It's hard to think of one of them without the other, but that's what I loved about this film, is that it really takes John for the most part out of it and the Beatles for the most part out of it. And it's like, how do you pick yourself up and put yourself back together and do something meaningful when you're 27 years old?
It's crazy.
You've just lived, you've been the biggest, most important rock star in the world. You've been in the most important band in history. Mm-hmm. And now it's like, okay, start your new life at 27.
Yeah. It's crazy. In 1 year, they record Let It Be, Paul gets married, they record Abbey Road, Paul has a kid, John says he wants to break up the band, and Paul moves to Scotland. 1 year. It's crazy. So at this point, then, he always ever known as being a Beatle since he was 15. So he has to figure out, who am I if I'm not a Beatle? And that's where the film begins.
Here we go.
Okay.
I'm going to play you a song. And I'm curious if you have an idea of where I'm going to start, but this is what I think is an appropriate song to start with.
Baby, I'm amazed the way you love me all the time. Maybe I'm afraid of the way I love you.
Should I call it? Maybe I'm amazed.
So
I'm sorry, I was just enjoying listening.
you were amazed.
Yeah, I am. I'm amazed. I am amazed.
So what's the story of that song in particular, right? That's
It's interesting because when Paul goes off to Scotland, he's not even sure if he's going to make music, and Linda encourages him, and he starts recording songs kind of on a 4-track machine. Yeah. This is before anybody has a 4-track machine in their house, and he records most of the album at home, but then he writes this one song that he knows is special. And so he goes into Abbey Road and he records the entire thing, all instruments by himself. And it's Maybe I'm Amazed. And it's really his thank you to Linda, his new wife, for really helping him through this time. And there's a theory about Maybe I'm Amazed that, John and George and Ringo had all released some solo music before. Paul never had. But all of their music was not that commercial, wasn't trying to be the Beatles. And John puts out Instant Karma. And it's the first song that's just an amazing song that maybe should have been a Beatles song. And the Beatles hadn't announced they were breaking up yet. And John performs it on Top of the Pops, and everybody is loving the song. 2 days later, Paul goes in to Abbey Road to record Maybe I'm Amazed. And maybe it's a little of like, okay, John, you're going to do that. We'll listen to this.
So at this point, there's a lot of business issues that everyone's dealing with, right? Because the band isn't officially broken up yet, like legally speaking. And they have this company together. There's a lot of entanglements that they have.
It's a total mess, and part of it, you can get deep into the weeds on it, but there was a manager, Alan Klein, that John liked, and Linda's father, Paul's new husband, Linda Eastman, her dad, Lee Eastman, was one of the top music industry lawyers in New York, and he was kind of the opposite of Alan Klein.
Yeah.
He was more kind of, buttoned up. Alan Klein was more of a kind of scrapper, and it just became a battle. Paul refused to sign on, and they signed their lives together in this Apple deal for the next 10 years. So extricating themselves from it took years and lawsuits and a ton of money. So it was a total mess.
Maybe I'm Amazed. What's the response to that song when it first comes out?
People love it. I mean, it's the one song that is kind of the single on McCartney, but there's actually a live version that he puts out a few years later that I think becomes the bigger hit.
It's really weird. It becomes a hit like years later, like 77 or something.
Yeah, it's on the live album, the Wings Over America, the name of that album, the live album. Anyway, so that becomes the single from that live album and becomes an even bigger hit.
There's this theme that I find with Paul where his songs kind of grow over time. There's a few, and his albums grow over time. So we're going to get into to some of the next ones that come later that at the beginning people don't really realize, and then you're like looking back, it's like incredible.
Well, at the beginning, people hated a lot of Paul's songs. Yeah, and that's part of the story of this time. These first few albums he put out, particularly, like people were not into them.
I want to play you one more song from McCartney. Because I think thematically this is an important one, and I want to get into why this song is important, and this is about a really important character.
Yeah, it's Lovely Linda, which I believe is the first song on McCartney, And there's even a moment at the top of the song where you hear the door squeak. And that's because Paul was recording it in his living room. And, Heather ran into the room and then the door squeaked and he said, well, that's what happens. So he left it in. And, that's a statement for Paul to make that the first thing he says on his first solo record is a love song, literally naming his wife, Linda. But again, when it comes out, people just say, well, this isn't the Beatles. What happened to the Beatles? I mean, I think there's this sense of heartbreak that everybody had about the Beatles, the fans, the critics, and it manifests oftentimes as anger. Like, what are you doing? Like, can you guys just get back together? There's just this constant pounding on, particularly on Paul.
Paul gets a lot of the blame. At least in the film, you touch on that a little bit, or he feels like he has to take some of the blame, even though it's John's.
It's because Paul was the one to actually say it out loud.
Yeah.
And it's because Paul wanted to finally release this first record. And he did this interview where he said, yeah, the Beatles are no more. The newspaper the next day said, Paul quits the Beatles. In Paul's mind, John had quit the Beatles months before. So really, it became a kind of popular idea that Paul couldn't break, that somehow Paul was the one that broke up the Beatles. But as Lennon said, Paul wanted the Beatles more than any of them. Paul was the one trying to keep them together. And if you watch Get Back, the Peter Jackson documentary, you see Paul just trying to hold it together. And then you see it now just kind of, fall away. And then, Paul just goes into this kind of tailspin.
Linda is a hugely important character in this, equal to Paul in this story. They're married, they're in love, they move to Scotland, but then she's a photographer.
Yeah, a big rock photographer,
Shot the cover of Rolling Stone.
Yeah.
But then she becomes a rock star with him. Maybe reluctantly, or maybe he convinces her to do that. Like, she wasn't a musician.
No, she sang in choir in high school, But Paul just thought, my family is going to be the center of my life.
Yeah.
So the kids, they're all inseparable. So he makes music in the house. He makes music with his family. When they go into his studio, the kids are in a crib in the middle of the studio. Like, there's no separating family from music. And Linda, Paul says, well, if I'm going to be doing this, you should do it with me, and she's never played a keyboard, but he says, well, you play keyboard, here's middle C. And so she becomes the keyboard player. And she's the first one to say, I'm not a very good musician, but she's there because they love each other. And I actually think, the sound of Wings, the band that he puts together, that sound is really the vocal blend of Denny Lane and Paul and Linda. But having that female voice is really what makes the McCartney music of the 70s different.
So he really, after the breakup of the Beatles and the retreat, loses himself in music and is just constantly working on and writing and noodling and playing stuff and recording stuff, like you said, very DIY at home, but also sometimes going to the studio and recording stuff, also going on the road, recording in other places.
I mean, he's probably doing that right now. It hasn't changed.
So this is just how he is.
That's how he is. That's who he is, going to work. I mean, I asked him about being a workaholic, and he said, well, you don't work music, you play music, so I'm a playaholic. And I get what he means. It's like he does it because it's his lifeblood. Yeah. It's like what he loves.
So before we go into any more songs,
yeah,
I want to go back and learn about this movie and how it came together.
I got a call from Paul's manager saying Paul's interested in maybe doing something about the Wings era. Uh-huh. And I said, yes, I'm in. Because I've been a Beatles fan, a Paul fan.
How long ago is this?
5 years.
Okay.
And I feel like I've been preparing for this film my whole life, because I've watched everything, I've read everything, I've listened to everything, and I've made a lot of music films. Yeah. But I was always wondering, am I ever going to work on anything about the Beatles? Mm-hmm. And so I actually feel like it was kind of the perfect moment for me, but I think it was the it was something that Paul wanted to do because I think Paul felt like this time, he didn't really understand this time. I don't think it was just, oh, I made some good songs and let's, work on selling some, box sets or something. I think really he feels like he didn't even really understand everything that was happening. And in a way, that's what happened with Get Back, too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think his memory of Get Back was so tainted by everybody saying you were such an asshole, that, and the original movie, Let It Be, was all the dark stuff and none of the light.
Across the universe, Jack
So Get Back made him think, well, it actually was way more nuanced. There was love there too and everything. And so that next chapter, the Wings chapter, which had been painful, also had a lot of light in it. So I think even this whole process of making the film is him kind of coming to terms with everything he did, because he did a lot in those 10 years.
So when you sign on to work on this film, how do you end up with the material that ends up in the movie? There's a lot of the interviews. You don't see the interviews on screen. Mm-hmm. They're audio only. And then there's all this incredible archival. You're not shooting new material for this movie, right? And then I want to talk about the animations and stuff after.
Yeah, I mean, the first interview I did with Paul, I went into his office and it was like two of us on a couch like this, except the entire couch was like this big. And Paul sitting here like this. He was like, okay. I was like, tell me about John. And okay.
You're recording that interview.
Recording
or just
audio.
Talking.
But recording audio. And then we had a great conversation. And, you can have a conversation without cameras sometimes that's just more casual. And Paul's been interviewed more than most humans on the planet. So part of it was trying to not just be in the normal mode of talking about things, but just like having conversations about everything in life. And then when, circling into a moment or a song and then, drifting away. Yeah. And Paul, I think, was enjoying it. So, it just became, these sessions where we get together and we talk. And then he had this incredible archive because Linda was a photographer and they filmed everything. And, he has a couple of archivists and everything. So it was organized and it was just downloading stuff, looking through everything and just getting a sense of the texture of everything else.
So there's a lot of photographs that sort of come to life.
Yeah.
There's even this sequence at the beginning where you tell like the Beatles story in rapid succession, and a lot of that's told through these photographs that sort of move and break apart and come back together and fold into each other. It feels very Yellow Submarine, or it feels like Beatles inspired, old Beatles inspired animation. Where did that come from?
I mean, I wanted to do animation that felt handmade, because that's kind of what the DIY aspect is. So much of what Paul was about at that time. Everything was do it yourself. And there was this animator from Canada who had done music videos named Winston Hacking. And I just had liked his stuff on Instagram or whatever. And I sent him an email and I said, would you ever think of working on a documentary? Yeah. And he was like, oh my God, I love McCartney and I love this idea. But because he does like stop motion with photographs and it's all kind of handmade stuff. And so it just felt totally organic to the film. And Paul, when Paul finally saw them, he loved it. He's like a huge animation fan. So it was cool. But part of it is just making it all feel like in some way the whole movie was from the 1970s.
Yeah. It does feel like an artifact from a different time. But so besides the interview with Paul, there's a lot of other, how do you do the other interviews? How do you choose the subjects? And are there other interviews that you're pulling in that you didn't?
Yeah. I mean, most of the interviews I did. I mean, everybody who was in Wings who I could get to, including Denny Lane, who I interviewed a few months before he died. He was the one consistent member from Wings from beginning to end. But other people like, Stella and Mary, the daughters, then people like Mick Jagger, who's kind of the opposite of Paul in so many ways. And just getting different perspectives on what he went through. I mean, from the people who were there, from the guys that designed the album covers to the roadie, kind of everybody, just to really get a full picture of what they went through.
So McCartney comes out, and then in pretty quick succession, they work on Ram. And Ram is Paul and Linda are both credited as making that album, which is the start of, okay, I'm going to get you to become a musician with me. Yeah. We're a family. We're working on stuff together.
Well, there's another reason for that too.
Why is
Which
that?
is all of Paul's money was tied up in this Apple deal. So if he co-wrote songs with Linda, half the money would go to Linda and it wouldn't be part of all these legal entanglements.
Wow.
So then there was a lawsuit where they said, well, Linda can't be writing these songs with you. And at one point, I think they had Linda write a song to prove that she could write a song on her own.
She's in court. They hand her a guitar. Go for it.
But kind of, and she acquitted herself well enough that, she was able to keep all that money. But I will say she didn't go on to write a lot more songs after this era.
So Ram, I want to play a song from Ram. Deeply misunderstood album when it first comes out. People are like, it's canned.
Yes.
And then later on, I think people now look back at it and say that album's incredible. A lot of this work is incredible.
Yeah.
But this is an ongoing theme of Paul being misunderstood. Definitely. And I think what stands out to me about this record is how experimental it is.
Yeah.
And out there. So this is probably the biggest song
We're so sorry.
from Ram.
This is from Ram.
And this is is this the biggest song? This is probably the most famous one on.
Another Day was another hit. These are the two hits on the album. This is Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey. Doesn't necessarily flow off the tongue, but I love this song because it's a pastiche. It's it's like a bunch of songs jammed into one song. It has different sections and it goes different places. It's a little, I guess you could say, Abbey Road-ish in that way. But I love this track.
It moves into, it's sometimes you forget that it's all one song. Like you'll hear a piece of Hands Across the Water and you're like, wait, that's the same thing.
Yeah.
People were, I guess, when I think about Paul, I also think about different decades. And there's the 60s where he does the Beatles. There's the 70s where he gets kind of more experimental and prog. And then there's the 80s where he goes, like everyone else, very 80s mode into synth weirdness.
Yeah.
But this is a marked, I think, transition away from...
Yeah, I mean, he's now going back into a studio.
Yeah.
I mean, this is really when he starts recording in studios again. And trying different things, but a lot of Ram, again, was written in Scotland. So it's songs about like Ram on the ukulele or Heart of the Country or, these pastoral songs about, life on a farm. And it just wasn't cool at the time. I mean, this is 1971, so this is probably the peak of kind of the political engagement of rock music, and so much was happening in the country and, anti-war protests and everything else. So people are like, what's Paul doing? So Ram was just savaged. I mean, I've read a lot of reviews and many of them were cruel, including the review I use in the film, which is the Rolling Stone review, written by John Landau. That calls it the nadir of 60s music thus far, that just so inconsequential,
I wonder what John Landau thinks about Ram now, if he still feels that way.
I'm sure he's changed his mind. At least I'm sure he would say he's changed his mind. John Landau is now Bruce Springsteen's manager and producer. So, it's interesting history. But now it's on the Rolling Stone top 500 albums of all time.
Yeah.
So seeing an album go from being such a pariah to beloved is interesting. But part of it is I think Paul has always been out of sync with time. And, he writes timeless music. And it may not work when it's written, but when you forget when it was written and you just come across it as a song, you're like, this is an amazing song.
So this there's this experimentation. He's trying things with McCartney 1. He's trying new things with Ram. But then he forms Wings, or around the same time that he's working on this, he starts to form Wings. Why move away from just, I'm going to work on my own to like, let's make a band again?
Well, part of it, I think, is he puts out these first two albums and people are just not liking them.
Yeah.
Even though they're selling pretty well.
Yeah.
but critics hate him. And so he said, well, I know what it's like being in a band. The Beatles were a band. We can just put together a band and start from scratch, start from square one, as he said, and just like grow. And so he puts together this band Wings, and he said, I'll just be the bass player and it'll all be equal, and we can just, start off as a scruffy band.
Yeah.
And it was never going to be that simple.
Yeah. And crucially, we can start playing shows and go on the road, right?
Paul always wanted to play shows.
Yeah.
And you see, in Get Back, for instance, Paul's often suggesting playing live, and the rest of them are at best ambivalent about it.
Because it was really hard for the Beatles to play. They had to stop basically, or they all collectively voted, let's stop playing live because it's kind of a nightmare.
Because you can't hear yourself.
Because everyone's screaming.
That's all it is.
They're not listening to the music.
Yeah.
And the technology's probably not good enough to project the music louder than the screaming that's happening.
Paul had an idea that he pitched to the Beatles that they didn't go for, that he did with Wings, which is, why don't we get a van and we'll just head out on the road and we'll show up at universities and we'll say, hey, can we play at lunch?
Yeah.
And he did that with Wings, going from university to university, trying to outrun the press who are trying to find them, and just randomly showing up and doing shows.
Hey, Paul's here. He wants to play a show. Is that cool? Can he? And the students are like, get out of here. And they're like, no, seriously, look, he's right there.
He's in the car. He's hiding in the car. And he's like, okay, yeah, we'll have him. Come on.
So they do their first album. There's a song on the first Wings album. It takes Wings. There's a song called Dear Friend.
Yeah.
Dear friend,
it takes a while for Wings to sort of hit their stride.
Yeah.
They have a couple albums before they really strike it big. Are you familiar with Dear Friend?
I am familiar with Dear Friend. I mean, there's a back and forth that happens between John and Paul in song. Paul writes the song Too Many People,
too many people.
which is a kind of veiled critique of some of John's outspokenness. And John, not one to be veiled, writes a very pointed song called How Do You Sleep? And it basically is just making fun of Paul and saying, the best thing you've done was yesterday, and, just pretty acidic.
Yeah.
And Paul then, rather than kind of engaging in this tit for tat, writes Dear Friend, after taking a breath and kind of extending this olive branch to John. And it works. I mean, the detente starts right there.
Every song that they've ever released up until these songs is even if they didn't both write it together, is they both get credit for. And of course, these are some of the most important songs of all time, and they've had huge success. Yeah. So it's like emotionally a difficult thing, and they're best friends. And they've grown up together since they were kids. It's emotionally a very hard thing to go through. And they're in their late 20s. They're not like, they're still young, figuring this out. So it's not surprising that they're so much, that they're in battle and trying to figure it out. But then they
Paul's
still love each
suing
other
them too. Don't forget that,
And they're probably hearing things from other kids, from Alan
they
Klein
have these, dueling managers and everything. So, it's a mess. So it's easy to understand why they're lashing out. And part of it is, it's one of the stages of, breaking up with somebody, I guess, is you kind of you're extra dismissive of it because you're just trying to distance yourself from it and distance yourself from that emotional pain of it too. Say, there's nothing there. But there's a magnetic force that pulls John and Paul together always, and it starts to happen again right then.
Let's listen to this next song.
When you were young and your heart
Was an open book, live and let die. I mean, I think this song is when Paul really started to get his mojo back.
Yeah.
He gets the assignment to write a song for a Bond movie, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the first time a male had ever sung a Bond song.
Say live and let die.
And he writes arguably the greatest Bond song of all time. And it's kind of at that moment where he is settling all the stuff with the Beatles. You know, he's starting to figure out, who am I as an artist? And he writes the song, and it's just killer. Like, it's just an amazing song. And it begins now an era of him just being so in the zone and just writing great song after great song. But I think it really begins with this assignment. And yeah, Paul nailed it.
So the next album that they release, or I guess they're working on at the same time, but he's starting to hit his stride, is Band on the Run.
Yeah, I don't think he'd started it yet.
So he starts it after this happens, and there's these huge songs on there. I mean, the movie's called Man on the Run, inspired by that. What is Band on the Run? What does that album sort of mean to you? I mean, in this context,
Band on the Run is his greatest album, I would say, of the 70s. I mean, it's just beginning to end, great song after great song. But the whole making of that record has got to be one of the weirdest records ever. You know, that on the eve, so Paul decides we're going to record the album in Lagos, Nigeria, because he saw that EMI owned a studio in Lagos. So they show up.
And it kind of just because.
Yeah, just
He's
because.
Like, what if we did this somewhere else?
Yeah, and again, it's one of Paul's crazy ideas. Like, why not? You know, we'll tour in a van. Oh, well, let's go record in Africa. And he had seen Fela Kuti on a BBC documentary.
That guy's cool.
And he's like, he's cool. There's good music happening there. We'll go there. Not with, as he said, doing no research, no homework. They just show up. But on the eve of leaving, 2 of the 5 members of Wings are like, oh, we're not doing that. And they quit. And so Paul and Linda and Denny show up in Nigeria to make this record with Jeff Emmerich, the amazing engineer. And the studio is like a shambles. Like, it's just a mess. And Paul essentially plays almost all the instruments himself on the entire album. Yeah. And the album is just phenomenal. I mean, the songwriting is phenomenal. And let's
listen to one.
Let's hear one.
It's hard to choose. I was going through these songs this morning, and I was like, what songs do we choose from this album? Because there's so many. All of them are like rock, like bangers. They're songs that you want to rock out to. And that's, like, for me, the marked transition. He's like, let's make rock and roll music again.
You know, Jet, some of those songs are just killer. But this song, Let Me Roll It, which is an amazing song. And that riff, just such a killer guitar riff.
Goes on for a while, too. He just leans into it.
I think this song is actually Paul putting on his John hat.
Yep.
I mean, he's definitely channeling Lennon on this track.
His vocal performance is
vocal performance, that kind of slapback vocal that Lennon always had too. No, I love that whole album. But yeah, that song, and that's a song that didn't get much attention when it came out, and has like grown and grown and grown. Now when Paul plays concerts, he plays that song and it kills. So it's just something that you put out in the ether and it takes flight or it doesn't.
So what's the reaction to this album when it comes out?
Finally, people are like, oh, you did all right, Paul. You know, I mean, critics are into it. The public is into it. It's a smash. It's like a #1 record. And it's like Paul's back, you know, suddenly Paul's back. And so that's kind of the attitude. I mean, I think Paul finally feels like, okay, I'm starting to find my way back to where I wanted to be. But at the same time, Wings doesn't even really exist anymore. You know, so he has to go back and find a new band again. And what he's trying to do is get finally out to do the kind of tour he's been wanting to do since he was in the Beatles.
And this is what we think of today as a big sort of rock and roll like stadium
Yeah,
kind
a
of tour.
giant,
Like what the Rolling Stones would do.
Yeah, yeah. And Paul very consciously is playing venues that are getting bigger and bigger. And he starts writing songs to be played in these bigger venues, like bigger rocking numbers. And I think Band on the Run's part of that too. And so they goes and kind of finds a new band and they start playing bigger venues, but he's still thinking, I'm going to go back to America and I'm going to kick ass, because he's still not played in America since Candlestick Park in 1966 with the Beatles. So it's this plan, I think, in the back of his head to like, when I get there, when I get back to the top, it's going to be Wings doing the tour I want to do on our terms in America.
Do you think he's like self-conscious of like the fact that it's that the audience that's coming to the shows are there because he's a Beatle? Are they there because he's Wings? Is that like a point of tension that he's feeling? I'm sure the other band members are like, this is the Paul McCartney show. Like, we're a band. Yeah. He wants us to be democratic and be called Wings, but this is about him. And
I mean, in the earliest days,
well, he didn't play Beatles songs at the beginning, right? Songs, but then he started to.
But on the big tour, when they finally have the Wings Over the World tour, they do like a little acoustic set in the middle with not even a handful of Beatles songs, So it wasn't like a Beatles show. It was still a Wings concert with, a few Beatles moments. And everybody wanted those moments. Everybody is just clamoring for any of it. But that balance of people saying, well, we like the other stuff now too. Like, it wasn't like the price to pay to hear the Beatles songs was you had to listen to the other stuff. Like, Wings were starting to grow and younger people were starting to come into Wings first.
Yeah.
As opposed to all the Beatles baggage. And, I was actually one of those kids.
You were a Wings fan and then you discovered the Beatles later.
I mean, I knew all the Beatles stuff and my dad loved the Beatles. He saw the Beatles and all that. So like, I always knew the Beatles, but like, I was the one going out and buying the new Wings album.
And the crowd, the audiences are really appreciative of the tour. And it's like, he's at the high point.
But it's kind of like Beatlemania again.
Yeah.
I mean, people just to see Paul McCartney in the flesh, he hadn't been in America for a decade, it was just the idea that he could do that. And remember, like, John wasn't touring, there were occasional concert here or there. And George did a little bit of touring, but, there was just this vacuum of people just craving a Beatle.
What else is happening around the same time musically? Is it like Led Zeppelin is the biggest
Zeppelin
rock band? Like who's in the league with Wings at this time?
The biggest rock acts of the 70s have got to be, Zeppelin was huge in terms of probably concerts, but Elton is huge, Queen, ABBA, I'm trying to think of some of the biggest acts of the 70s. But Wings are top 5 in the end of the 70s. McCartney and Wings are top 5 acts of the 70s. But when you talk about the 70s, nobody ever mentions them.
Yeah. So what do you think is that just because he's no matter what is always going to be overshadowed by the Beatles? And
the gravitational pull of the Beatles swallows everything. At the end of the day, it's always going to be Beatles first, and I think that's part of why I called the film Man on the Run is like, he's trying to escape this shadow and there's no escaping it, but that doesn't mean you should stop trying to escape it. And he does a pretty good job at starting to, build something separate from the Beatles. But in the wake of all of this, the Beatles still swallow everything.
Let's fast forward a little bit later on in the Wings period. Venus and Mars is a big album still. Wings is at the top of their game.
11 song.
So good. And then there's another song that's also completely different. It doesn't, it's like, what is he doing?
Exactly. Mull of Kintyre you know, a Scottish folk song, you know, again, it's like one of Paul's weird ideas that works. I mean, it becomes the biggest selling single in British history. Over here, it's not much of a hit at all.
Yeah.
But in England, it is a smash to the point where if you still go to a football game in Scotland, they're singing this song. But it's him just trying something different. I mean, that's Paul's whole thing is like, I'm just going to do what my gut tells me. And that's kind of one of the lessons of this whole period of like not doubting your own creative instincts. Like it's up to the world to judge these things. You just make them. And, you know, Paul makes things. Some of them are really good and some aren't, but that's okay. You know.
And then we get to the end of Wings.
Ooh, baby, you couldn't have done a worse thing to me. If you'd have taken an arrow,
I love the album cover.
right through
It's
me.
great. Arrow Through Me. I love this track. I mean, this is album I bought when it came out, like
Yeah.
the week it came out. And I stared at that album cover so long.
Yeah.
I mean, hours. You know, it was so cool.
This is the end. This album is
This is the end. They didn't know it. Nobody knew it was the
but
end.
it just didn't sell as well.
It didn't sell as well. You know, and he actually put out a single that was a hit just before called Goodnight Tonight, which I love.
Don't say it, don't say
And he refused to put the single on the album because back in the Beatles days, they would, you know, do singles separate from the albums. And in America, they all got packaged together, but in England, they weren't. And this album was, you know, kind of, again, maligned and didn't sell that well, but I love Back to the Egg. Like, I think it's a really cool record. And this track, I think it was one of the all-time great McCartney tracks.
It's insane. It's funky. And it tracks also the changing times, right? The musically changing times.
Yeah.
He's like very much with it in the disco. This is like in the disco.
There's like
kind
a
of
little
funk
disco
era.
but even on that album, like there are like almost punk kind of songs in that album, and then disco kind of songs, and then like an old timey, you know, 1930s kind of tune on that album. You know, it's just Paul doing that. But again, I don't know, go back to the White Album or whatever. It's like there's a whole bunch of variety in those songs too, from like Martha, My Dear,
Yeah.
you know, to Helter Skelter.
After Wings breaks up, his reaction is to make McCartney 2 and just like go right back to
No, it happened differently.
How does it happen?
So Back to the Egg comes out in the spring and like doesn't do great. And so Paul goes back to Scotland for the summer and he's gotten some synthesizers and he just starts screwing around with them and basically records a bunch of music more as just like an experiment. And then he goes back out on tour with Wings and he's just not feeling it. And then they go to Japan. And Paul brings a giant bag of marijuana with him into a country that did not take such things lightly.
Self-sabotage? Maybe?
He says he still doesn't know. I think there's an element of that. I think there's an element of, you know, if it goes sideways, so be it, because I'm not into it.
There's this amazing scene in the documentary where they're like rehearsing for this Japan tour, and they're kind of, you can tell like by the look on his face that they're not really ready to play these shows, and he feels kind of like, I don't know if
And he's fed up, and he has another son, James, with Linda. So at this point, they have 4 kids.
Yeah.
He's just not feeling anything. So they go to Japan. He gets thrown into jail for 9 days. And at one point, you know, Linda is thinking about getting a house outside of Tokyo to raise the children. So if he spends 7 years in jail, you know, they'll be together, at least in the same country.
Yeah.
And then finally, the Japanese government is just so embarrassed by it because there are throngs of people in front of the jail. You know, it's getting international press every single night, that they'd throw him out of the country.
Yeah.
And he goes home and immediately starts mixing his weird synth experiments, and it becomes McCartney 2.
And it's just, why does he do this McCartney thing? McCartney 1, McCartney 2. Later on, I did McCartney 3. Did he speak to that at all? Like what?
Yeah, I mean,
what falls into that bucket versus his other?
McCartney 1 he made right after the Beatles broke up, and McCartney 2 he made right after Wings broke up, and he did it completely by himself. And I just think it's where his head's at, and he does those albums with no expectation. It's not like, oh, the label's looking for you to do this kind of thing. It's like, no, I'm doing this for me. These are like my home demos that actually become hit albums.
I want to play a song from McCartney 2.
Love McCartney 2.
Weird. Just like weird,
Totally.
but fun.
Totally fun. And there's also a live version of this that was a big hit, I think, in the States. But this song has such a great groove to it, and one of the all-time great music videos. Just with Paul playing all these different versions of Rockstar. God, I love that song. And that's the song that John Lennon hears and says, maybe I should start making music again. I mean, literally coming up, he decides to go back and records Double Fantasy, his last record.
Did you talk to Paul much, like about how was it asking him questions about like John? It's a little bit in the movie, but about John dying, and his reaction to that is famous, like because it's also sort of misunderstood.
Yeah, I mean I think in the beginning, I didn't know how he would be talking about John in general.
Yeah.
And Paul loves to talk about John.
Yeah.
I think Paul thinks of John every day, and, so that part I think he really enjoyed. But then when it came time to really talk about John's passing, it still hurts so much, that, there was this connection between them. And I think it's just speculation, but I think if John had lived, they would have played together again. Like, I just think they both wanted it, and they both had said enough things enough times that I just think it would have happened. But, that kind of, that thing that had been following them ended when John died. Suddenly it's not about the Beatles getting back together. It's like, it's over. It was just the end of something, and it was something that, I remember as a kid who was a huge Beatles fan, like it was the first great loss in my life, like I remember just the grief I went through. And that everybody felt that. It was devastating for everybody. And Paul has to deal with it. And, there's a moment in the film where he's confronted on the street by reporters the night of John's death, and kind of gives a kind of a cold reaction to it and then leaves. And then, of course, that became the story, and I think part of it was the reporters were they wanted to get Paul to be emotional, but part of it is I think Paul was in shock too. Yeah. Like, I just don't think he knew what to think at that moment. And I think it took him many, many years to even come to terms with that.
How does the movie end? Like in terms of the history and the chronology, like why does it end?
Well,
where it does, and
because I feel, Wings hadn't totally died.
Yeah.
But once John dies, Wings never play again. They never record again. Paul goes back to work with George Martin and plays with Ringo and just starts to embrace the Beatles Paul, and I feel like all the different Pauls just become Paul McCartney. Yeah. The Paul we have today begins at the end of this film.
So it's like he's not on the run anymore.
No.
He's kind of settles.
I'm just Paul. And I think, to me, that's why it felt like the ending. He kind of went on this journey, which is the best of times and the worst of times, but it's the thing that made him finally who he is. And Sean Lennon says in the film, for all of us, but particularly for Paul too, the real growing up in life was John dying. And it was the moment where he really had to put away, childish things and just became the man he is.
You've made documentaries about so many different musicians.
Yeah.
Why is that a subject? Why is music a subject that interests you as a documentary
I'm a music
filmmaker?
geek through and through, and a musician, and I love music. But also I feel like we're talking about, like, music is a Trojan horse.
Yeah.
Like, you can talk about all kinds of things, and I've made music about, soul music and country music and rock music and jazz, and I love it all, but it takes you into different worlds, and what film can do is a version of what music can do, which is lets you walk in somebody else's shoes, lets you feel empathy for their experience, and the music is the familiar thing that might hook you. It's like, oh, I know that song. I like that song, or I like that artist. So once you get them watching your movie, you can tell whatever story you want.
Is there one takeaway, like life lesson that you take away from Paul McCartney?
I mean, it's interesting. I've showed this film to a bunch of teenagers who don't really know any of it.
Yeah.
And they loved it because it's about a young person trying to live an artistic life and find their voice and kind of doing what they want in spite of what the world tells them they should be doing. And that part of it, is so admirable to me. So I want people to take that away.
When is it out?
Out
Available to stream.
Available now, maybe this Friday.
As soon as by the time this is out,
By the time this is out, it's out on Amazon Prime. Check it out.
This was really a blast. I feel
Awesome.
like this playlist, just a starting point, but we got some pretty good songs on there.
Some great songs.
It's hard to miss with Paul.
I know, but there's a deep rabbit hole to go down. Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you. The Trackstar Podcast is a presentation of Public Opinion created by me, Jack Coyne, Kieran Coyne, and Henry Cornaros. Written and produced by Noah John. Edited and produced by Haley Sobel. Theme and original composition by Kieran Coyne. Mixing by Devin Klein. Our agent is Joanna Orland at UTA. Thanks for listening. See you next Wednesday.